This just kind of gives you some of the credentials that I've amassed in the last 3 decades. I've been with the University of Florida since 2004. I'm what's called an affiliated research assistant professor. What that means is they don't pay me anything and I don't agree to do anything, but they like listing me on the books and I like having free access to research journals. So when its time is right, we collaborate on things, and otherwise we just help each other indirectly. I did train at the University of Florida, as I said, as well, in the Department of Clinical and Health Psychology, and I'm what's called a neuropsychologist. So a neuropsychologist is a brain scientist who studies all of the behavior and also studies the brain and understands how the two work together. And part of the goal is to figure out what skills are building easily, what skills are not building easily, and what can we do about it. And I'll give you an explanation of how I've trained not only in pediatric developmental, but I've also trained in adult, I've also trained in geriatric older adult, I've also trained in neurorehabilitation, which means you had an injury to your brain somehow. And that injury would cause you to lose some skills. We know how to test it to figure out what skills you've lost. Then the question is, what do we do to help rebuild those skills? Is there some way you can actually help restore some of your functions? And I spent 10 years of my professional career working with 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70-year-olds who had had a brain damage, brain injury, and we had to figure out how to rebuild their reading skills, how to rebuild their spelling skills. That's about 1,000 times more complicated than trying to help a kid who just has genetic developmental dyslexia. And I'll explain more about those. I also spent a large portion of my career doing what's called neuroimaging. That means we put you in this very unpleasant machine called an MRI machine that makes all this kind of loud banging, clanging noises, and we take pictures of your brain anatomy, but we can also take pictures of where's the fuel going to parts of the brain. And wherever that fuel is going, we know that's the part of the brain that's doing the work. So I've published in neuroimaging, I've published in neurorehabilitation, I'm published in early prevention of learning disabilities at age 5, and we're published in remediation of learning disabilities in elementary school and up through the age groups. But doing all that research is great for your professional career, but it may not get to you. It may not get to mom and dad. So one list you see on here is the Einstein School. The Einstein School is just a couple hours north of here, about an hour and a half, in Gainesville, Florida. That is the nation's very first free charter school, only for kids who have learning disabilities. All 120 kids in that school have learning disabilities. If you do not have a learning disability, we're typically not going to enroll you in the school. It's grades 2 through 8, and both my companies, both my online ed tech company, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and my medical clinics companies provide that school with training, with support, with our methods, with the things that we've built in research, and help put that into the school. And we started that back in 1999. The reason we started the Einstein School in '99 is we just finished $2 million of big research projects. We just had figured out how to help early intervene at age 5 and stop most kids from actually struggling to learn to read. You could call it preventing dyslexia, but some people get really upset about that because they're like, it's genetic and it's neurological and you can't stop it. Well, you can early intervene and it can be improved so much that the child doesn't have reading difficulties. I know because I'm one of those kids. At age 5, my older brother was 7 and he couldn't read well. Lucky for him, our aunt and uncle were world famous for their work in dyslexia. She was a speech therapist and he was a linguist. So naturally, what does our mother do? She made a family trip to California, and we lived in small town Missouri. We thought we were just going to see the West Coast, but actually Mother was going to train with my Aunt Patricia Conway Lindamood to do some work on dyslexia and learn how to do this intervention program that the Lindamoods had written in 1969. So lucky for us, that was our aunt and uncle, that was my dad's older sister. My brother got remediation at age 7, and he never struggled in school after that point. But at the end of first grade, he couldn't read at all. He was completely a non-reader. Today, he's a decorated military intelligence officer. At times reports to people very high in the federal government in Washington, D.C. We have one person in D.C. who has the initials of DNI. And right now it's a woman. She is the DNI. Anybody know what the DNI is in Washington, D.C.?
Director of National Intelligence.
It's our Director of National Intelligence. That means you have the FBI who has a director, you have the CIA who has a director, you have Homeland Security who has a director, and then the director over the directors is the Director of National Intelligence. So my brother John has had a tremendous career because he didn't struggle to learn to read. it didn't provide blocks or interfere with his ability to pursue what he chose to pursue. So consequently, my mother decided not to wait and see if I struggled, so I am a 5-year-old prevention kid who got early intervention with, at that time, what we call our research-based programs. It means we hadn't done any of the big $1 million studies yet to see if it's really highly effective, but we had good success, good results, and it was coming from speech pathology and linguistics, which are two of the brain science language experts. Consequently, I've never struggled to read and spell. But we said learning difficulties are genetic. Now, I love that this conference has so many kids, because I love this one thing I get to tell kids who come to my clinics or my online staff or working with them. I say, do you know who you get to blame for your reading problems? And unfortunately, first they say, my teacher. I'm like, nope, not her fault, not his fault. I said, you get to blame mom or dad. And they're like, really? I'm like, well, which one of them can't spell? Dad can't spell at all. Well, you can blame dad. It's genetic. You got dad's genes, and it just led to a little inefficiency in how the brain's working, but inefficiencies can be changed. We'll work on that later. But I said then, guess who dad can blame? I'm like, grandma and grandpa, because one of them probably has it too. So it's just, we inherit from our parents our strengths and weaknesses, and that leads to some of the difficulties over time, and that could lead to a thing we call dyslexia. We'll talk more about what dyslexia really is. There's more myths about dyslexia than there is actually accurate information getting to parents. Part of the reason is there's no license required to open a dyslexia clinic. Anybody under the sun can set up a building, set up a shingle, hang a sign and say, we are the World Dyslexia Treatment Center, and there's no requirement for what they do. They can make up anything they want, and if you pay for it, you get it. And so consequently, you have program after program after program that are usually well-intentioned people, but they haven't met the standard that we have in medicine. Let me explain that standard. If you go to your pediatrician, and imagine this, your pediatrician says, I've got this chem lab in my office, and I've been working on these chemicals because I know the chemicals in penicillin, and I know the chemicals in amoxicillin, and I know the chemicals in all the other antibiotics, and I've been combining a few of my own way. I want to put my own chemical. I think I have my own antibiotic. We're going to try this with Johnny for his strep throat. No parent's going to agree to that, and for that physician, you know what we call that if he tried or she tried to do that? We call that medical malpractice. If you don't give a child something that's been tested and proven to be highly effective in the medical field, and that means all healthcare professions, speech pathology, occupational therapy, clinical psychology, if you don't use the standard best proven methodologies from research and you make something up, you're at risk for being charged with malpractice. But that standard doesn't exist in education. And I say that with all due respect because my mother, at 89, is about to turn 90 years old this summer, is a retired special ed teacher. And she did everything the school would let her do, or every program they would actually buy for her, and usually had very dismal results. Not for her lack of trying or for her lack of effort, but if you don't give the educators scientifically proven and tested to be really effective programs, we shouldn't expect them to be highly successful. Because if we didn't give pediatricians amoxicillin, guess how many people would be dying from strep throat a year? It would be a lot. Or penicillin, or any of the other antibiotics. It's by giving them these tested and proven high success methodologies, we can actually help raise the outcomes and raise the better outcomes over time. So the Einstein School was set up in 1999 to provide you with a model of how we take a program that's been tested by 10 years, and then actually another 5 years after that of high caliber science, the same caliber of science that built penicillin. Now here's a funny question. Who knows how long ago penicillin was invented? Any idea? Who thinks it's more than 20 years ago? More than 40 years ago? Yeah, more than 50 years ago. Yeah, you're right. It's been almost half a century since they invented penicillin. But guess how many recent studies we have on penicillin? 0, because it's already been proven. And until somebody does some new studies and comes up with a new antibiotic that is tested and compared to penicillin and is proven to be better than penicillin, we do not stop using penicillin. But in educator conferences that I'll speak at, or in parent conferences, many times people will say, well, the research you're bringing us is more than a few decades old. Got any new research? I'm like, well, that's the wrong question. The right question is, has anybody published any research that showed better outcomes than what you've got? Because if they haven't beaten you with that high caliber of research, it's just like penicillin, then we don't stop using it. So it's not important how new the research is, it's important the caliber of it and the gains that were made. And we'll show you an example that looks like here. Let me jump ahead to a little boy, and this little boy shows you what it looks like to have reading struggles. And I'm going to jump over to a YouTube channel. This is a really quick 59-second video. We didn't test sound, but we hope we got it.
He picked the summer, no sense of and summertime and shorts. He picked.
How's he doing? Yeah, he's struggling tremendously. How does he feel about that? Yeah, not very good. I mean, he's just squirming in that chair. This is emotionally painful for him to have to do this and be recorded as well. He's 8 years old. He's been diagnosed with dyslexia. He has an IEP. He's in special ed. But let me ask you one really important statistic about special ed in the United States. What percentage of children get so much successful intervention in special ed that they leave special ed because they don't struggle anymore, and now they go on to regular ed? Basically, I'm asking you, what's the success rate of special ed? Yeah. One stat shows 5%. That means 95% of children who get an IEP never really get much better. And from a science perspective, what we tell you is that's because most IEPs are to throw in a few made-up things. Let's try a little of this, let's try a little of that, and nobody knows if it works or not, and we keep using the kids as the guinea pigs as if there's no research that tells us what to do. Because unlike healthcare, which is required and legally obligated to use evidence-based methods, that standard doesn't exist in education. So what I blog about or what I hashtag about and talk about on LinkedIn or is educational malpractice. Giving kids made-up stuff is no different as educational malpractice than a physician mixing a few chemicals and thinking they've made their own antibiotic. Because you're putting the child at unnecessary risk, and it is actually a risk of harm. We have more and more studies, and I'll show you one or two of the studies of the emotional trauma that goes along with lifelong or continuous reading difficulties. The higher increase of suicide, the higher increase of depression, the higher increase of drug abuse, incarceration, domestic violence. There's this list after list of negative things that could happen if we don't help empower literacy skills for kids. So not only do we have a 5% success rate in our special ed system, but we know that if we look at our success rate of literacy across the United States, and the government has been doing this for more than 3 decades, every 2 to 4 years, they grab a sample of 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th graders in every state across the United States. You can look it up online. It's called nationsreportcard.gov. If you go to the nationsreportcard.gov, you'll see this data for many decades, and I'll show you a graph of it. But to give you a preview, in 1992, 4th, 8th, and 12th graders, what percentage of them actually were reading at grade level? Let me caveat that. Grade level means you only got to get to the 25th percentile. Because in that bell-shaped curve, that's the start of the category we call average. So if you're at least at the 25th percentile, you're on grade level. Now, albeit, if you got a kid with an IQ at the 80th percentile, you really should not be aiming for grade level at the 25th percentile, because that means your kid's got more than a 60 percentile gap in their potential and in their actual performance. But today, across the United States in 1992, back in 1992, I should say, 4th, 8th, and 12th graders, only 35% were reading proficiently. But let's take 1992 to 2021. How much better have we gotten? It used to be 35%. What do you think it is now? Give me a guess. 21. It's gone down. COVID's killed it. It's still 30 to 35%. It's a flat line from 1992 until 2021. We've seen zero progress in literacy rates in the United States in the last 30 plus years. That's not COVID, and that's not dyslexia, because dyslexia does not affect 65% of the population. So why does 65% of the population struggle to learn to read? Because we are not required to give them programs that have been tested and proven to be effective. Every person under the sun in school has their belief on what they think is a good reading program. It's their philosophy. So education today, when it comes to literacy, is what we call an ideology. It's what I think. And philosophy, it's what I feel. What I think and what I feel is all that matters. And you can talk to many teachers who have been frustrated by their school. They don't really like the curriculum the school bought. They're required to use it for literacy, and as soon as that door shuts, they do what they want. Because as long as it looks like they're following what they're supposed to be doing, but they don't really believe in it, they're going to try to do what they think is going to work because they really genuinely want to help the kids. But let me show you what's possible, because here's the same boy, and as the video says, this is the same boy who in that video, he's reading at the 5th percentile. Okay, he's in the bottom 5%, despite being in special ed for over a year and getting his individualized education plan. See if you can see any difference, but notice if there's any difference in how he also feels about being videotaped.
It was time to get up and go to school. The children made their beds and dressed. One kid said, can I find my red shoes? Mother said,
How's he doing now? He's now reading at the 45th percentile. So in just 2 months' time, that says 9 weeks, it actually was 8 weeks of instruction and 1 week of testing. In just 2 months' time, we took him from the 5th percentile to the 45th percentile. And not just him, 30 other kids just like him. Yes?
How many times a week?
Great question, because one thing that drives the brain in learning is not only intensity of instruction, which means how much time in each lesson, but is also frequency of instruction. So in all of healthcare, when we're focused on using the brain to empower it, it's always 5 days a week. Even if you are geriatric and you break a hip and you go into the hospital to get it treated for a hip and the Medicare is going to demand PT, you know how much PT they want you to have? They want you to have 6 days a week of PT. Why? Because they know you'll discharge faster. So it was 5 days a week and it was 2 45-minute sessions per day. So about an hour and a half of actual contact time. Because the question was, can you even change this? This is not a model that we said the schools can implement, but if we can't change it, then there's no point in trying to get schools to do it. So the first question in this study was, can you even change these skills? And the answer was, we could only afford to give each kid 80 hours of instruction. That kid and the others like him, on average, only got 67.5. In 8 weeks, they still couldn't come to school every day for 8 weeks. They missed about 10 to 20 hours of school. But then we raised his literacy rates, and we did that with his other friends as well. But the other question is, yeah, but what happened to them later on? What happens after you stop the intervention? And I'll show you a little graph about that, but basically what we saw was 1 year later, the skills are stronger, and we've done no more instruction in this methodology. 2 years later, the skills are even stronger. And what did we say the success rate was of special ed? What percent? 5. In this research study, 40% left special ed with only getting 8 weeks of intensive instruction. So we show that it's perfectly possible. The brain has the plasticity. The brain has the learning potential, but what you do, how you do it, how frequent you do it, with what intensity, and a few other factors really has a big impact on how you change the learning and the wiring of the brain. Let me jump back over here and let me clarify one thing, just so we're all on the same page. For people who are actually diagnosed dyslexia, this is the book they have to use. So clinical psychologists can diagnose dyslexia. Speech pathologists can diagnose dyslexia. Educational psychologists typically cannot. School psychologists typically cannot. Dyslexia specialists typically cannot. They're not typically licensed to diagnose dyslexia. That's a more advanced degree diagnosis, and they have to go to this book. This is called the DSM-5, and it lists the national criteria that all healthcare professionals are supposed to follow to diagnose dyslexia. But it's also called a specific learning disorder. And we've got 3 types of specific learning disorders. There's the reading problems, there's the writing problems, and there's the math problems. That's the dyslexia, dysgraphia, and dyscalculia. But it has key elements, which is, it says there's going to be inaccurate or slow reading accuracy, but there also could be difficulties with reading fluency. So it's accuracy, fluency, or comprehension are the 3 things that can lead to a diagnosis of dyslexia. Has nothing to do with seeing things backwards, has nothing to do with visual processing, has nothing to do with knowing the right and left. This is the core criteria to diagnose dyslexia is either poor accuracy, or poor speed of reading, or poor comprehension. And in that situation of that video of that boy, What was his story about that he read? Did you get that? Did you get the content of what he was reading? Yeah, he didn't either. Because what you didn't know was he read about a sentence and a half into it, and then he went back and started all over. Because he knew he had no idea what he just read, and he knew we were going to ask him questions afterwards. So he was struggling both, yes.
Where did he start out? What was his metric at the beginning? What was the metric at the end?
Fifth percentile on nationally normed standardized tests of reading and reading comprehension. 45th percentile at the end of the 8 weeks.
Sorry, the beginning number was what?
Fifth percentile, 5. So it was basically it's like about a 22 standard score point gain. So if you're a diagnostician, you know we measure everything in standard score points. But for parents, let's talk about where they are in the percentiles.
So what intervention program did you use for that? I know the frequency.
Yes.
But what is the intervention?
So from this study, we built a program, and we built it upon, let me show you this here. The Lindamoods had published a program in 1969. They published a program called Auditory Discrimination in Depth. And from 1969 until about mid-95 or so, it was known as the ADD program. But by 1995, ADD came to mean something else to the general public. So they rebranded it at that time into the LIPS program. Okay, well, we took the ADD program, and as a team of researchers and brain scientists, we were developmental behavioral pediatricians, OTs, speech pathology, clinical psychologists, and we began to modify it. So we took their original 1969 program, modified it. Today it's called Now Foundations for Speech, Language, Reading, and Spelling. So because we set up this school model and we were not successful getting schools to adopt what we were doing, then we went ahead and built our own online company. Today we have over 500 kids online every day getting these services, and the majority of those 500 kids actually aren't paying anything. Your schools have access, and listen carefully, your schools, your public schools have access to $200 billion. But the majority of you guys are homeschooling. So this pushes in anywhere in the world. We've got over 100 instructors online. We're pushing out the literacy program services. We're doing either one-on-one or 1-to-2, 1-to-3, or 1-to-4 small group instruction. We scale the pricing based on how many kids are in the group. We try to get the widest price points possible. Right now we're down as low as $40 an hour for that group instruction, or we're up as high as $75 an hour for the one-on-one. And it's been that price for 10 years since we opened the company. Yes?
Do you take the Florida Empowerment Scholarship?
Yes, you can use the Florida Empowerment Scholarship. There's just some nuances in how we have to make sure that's being done, because they only will allow certain of our instructors to actually qualify as the delivery of instructors for that services.
And at what age does a child officially get a diagnosis of dyslexia, and what age can they start showing signs?
You can start seeing signs as young as 4, and here's how you measure it. You guys can do this at home. I've been going around telling pediatricians how to do this. I'm going to say a word, you just say it back to me. It's real simple. The word is cat. Everyone just say cat. Okay, now I want you to do it again, but this time, don't say the k sound. Leave that off. Just say it without that. How'd you do that? So here's the brain science interpretation of what just happened. I gave you an acoustic input. You heard a word. Some of you can see my mouth, but in the back you can't. So most of you, it's getting acoustics. You held the word in head. You split it apart into sounds, and I told you to take out the k. You had to figure out where the k was. I didn't tell you where it was. I didn't tell you it was first, second. You figured out it was first. You thought, well, actually, I know how to spell cat, and that's the C, and I visualized. And you could actually use letters in your head, too, and take it off, and then you put it back together and got your mouth to actually say it. So it's acoustic to visual to sensory motor, and then it just comes out effortlessly. So 4- and 5-year-olds who are not going to struggle to read and spell are proven to be very strong at that one skill. The name of it is phoneme elision. A professional test that measures it is called the Comprehensive Test of Phonological Processing, or the CTOP. But you can just do a basic bedside screener. We tell the pediatricians, just give the kid a couple words, cat, make him take off the k. But I'll get back to it, but let me test you really more thoroughly. Here's how you really check your phonological skills, is I'm going to give you a word that you've never heard of before. It follows all the conventions of English, but it doesn't have any meaning. Ready? The word is snoisk. I want everyone to say snoisk. Okay, now I want you to say it again, but don't say leave that part out. What you have left is? How'd you do that? You've never heard snoisk, you've never spelled snoisk, you've never seen snoisk in a book, but I could have said to you as well, how about pusillanimous? And if you didn't know that, pusillanimous is actually a real word. But if you do, if you've never heard it before, I might as well be saying snoisk. But words are just a combination of sounds. So your ability to hold it in head, split it apart, and judge a deletion of the sound is the #1 predictor of dyslexia at age 4 and 5. And that came from a 5-year longitudinal study in Florida State. So putting that into practice means we can do better diagnosis and better treatment and then actually help kids build better skills. But the real goal of all this is, here's what it looks like in today's literacy rates across the United States. This is that nation's report card.gov. You can see from this one, this is 1992 to 2017, that's the literacy rates of 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders, a random sampling across every state in the United States, which basically says what we're allowing the school system to do is not working. Okay? There's a big push now to actually become what we call the science of reading. Well, the science of reading is going to take us just halfway. Because let me give you the analogy of the science of reading. If I said I want to train a bunch of pastry chefs, and I want to train them to be really good pastry chefs, and I'm just going to tell them the ingredients that should go in cakes. Cakes should have flour and milk and butter and eggs and baking soda, but I'm not going to give them the recipe. Okay? We're not going to get a consistent group of advanced or successful pastry chefs because we're only going to give them half of the equation. The ingredients without the recipe means you're not going to be as successful. So the science of reading is really just a list of ingredients. A reading curriculum should have some sight words in it. A reading curriculum should have some phonological processing, some comprehension. And we have this reading rope, and we have all these other graphics that talk about the components, but actually don't give you the recipe of how to do it, how much, to what degree, as was asked before, with what intensity or what frequency. All of the details of the ingredients are left out. And so that's not going to make a major shift in our literacy rates in the country.
Have you ever had experience working with genetic disorders like Puro syndrome, which is a neurological development disorder, and you work with that with your kids?
In neuropsychology, you see everything. So we've seen tubular sclerosis, neurofibromatosis, other very rare genetic disorders. Even if you have a genetic disorder, your brain still has neuroplasticity. And there's only one thing that inhibits that child from making progress. It's how much you don't know. Because how much you don't know will interfere with your ability to actually figure out what to do with this child to help build the skills. So from brain plasticity, we know that you actually have to have intensive instruction, frequent instruction, and systematic instruction. But let me show you all the criteria together, because all the criteria together then really help break down all the parts of what we want to be sure we have in there, which then helps us make sure that we're making the most progress. And that looks like this. We know the instruction has to be, there it goes, high intensity, which means it should be at least 5 days a week. And this is true of anything. Moms will laugh with this question. Ready? How many of you did potty training only on Tuesdays and Thursdays? Yeah, that is ridiculous. Well, but how many of your kids get speech therapy twice a week for 20 minutes? It's just as ridiculous. How many of your kids get OT twice a week for 30 minutes? And the speech therapy, oh, by the way, many times is in a group of 5. And so that intensity of how much time per day, which means 45 minutes, 2 hours, what's the duration, plus the frequency, which means how many days per week, plus the specificity, how explicit are your instructions. Let me give you an example of that. When you taught your child how to ride a bike, you might have given bike riding lessons every day. Maybe you're going to spend an hour a day working on bike riding, but did you only say to the child, ride it, ride it, ride it, ride it? What's the outcome going to be? Probably a lot of crashes. Probably not getting a lot better because you're not really giving them very specific instructions on what to do. You have to tell them about how to move the handlebars, how to work the pedals, how to brake by pushing back or squeeze the handlebars. They need explicit, specific instructions. And then number 4 is, and the instruction should be in a developmental hierarchy. Basic skills first, advanced skills later on. That's how the brain builds every skill best. Doesn't matter if it's reading, macrame, swimming, spelling, anything you're going to teach the brain, these are the tenets of neuroplasticity, which means this is how the brain learns new skills. The last 2 parts are duration. If you do daily instruction for an hour, and you think, I'm going to do 5 days, and we got that. 5 days of reading instruction, 1 hour a day, 5 days a week, we're done. Probably not. Because that duration has to be enough time until that skill becomes automatic, it becomes effortless. Think back to when you learned how to drive a car. When you're learning how to drive a car, how well did you build the skills? Or let me put it this way. How much of your brain focus power did it take to do the car driving? You got your hands, you got these two sticks on the side, you got 2 pedals or 3 pedals, and some of us who are older had another column up on the steering wheel, and not a shifter on the floor, but a shifter on the steering wheel, and you had to navigate all this stuff. Plus, if you lived in an area with hills, you're having to work out the clutch and not slide back down the hill. There are so many things to think about. It took all of your brain power to learn how to drive a car. Now, I won't ask this because it would be embarrassing, but we could say how many of you were fixing your hair, or talking on your phone, or talking to the kids while you're driving today? Because it only now takes this much of your brain power, which basically means you've practiced it so much it's highly automatic. So that's that duration, enough practice until you build the skills to a level of automaticity. There's no magic number. Some people say, oh, it takes 1,000,000 practices to make a habit. Well, good luck with that, because that doesn't always happen, and many times it doesn't take 1,000,000, so thankfully it could be quicker. But then the last part is, how do you generalize the skills? You have to take the skills you've been practicing and not only use them in your lesson, but also use them in the classroom, or use them at the market, or use them at the restaurant, or use these reading skills when you're looking at street signs down the road. You want to carry over those skills to other environments, and that's what generalization means. You have to practice the skills, build the skills, and then use them in other environments. And that gives us the best chance to have those skills build and grow. When we look at that from a brain perspective, when we've done things like that, then here's what you're going to see. This is what the brain looks like when we're talking about a child who has reading trouble on the bottom half and a child who does not on the top half. These are fMRI brain imaging pictures of their brain. The child who does not have reading trouble, over there, and this is reversed, but the right side of the screen, but says the left side of the brain. The left side of the brain is doing more of the work, and the right side is not doing as much. It's not really designed to be the reading part of the brain. It can be, but it's not really its natural proclivity or natural wiring is for reading skills. The kid down at the bottom is a kid who's struggling to read, that little boy you saw in the video. What do you see on the left side of his brain? Yeah, not as much activity. What do you see on the right side? They've got more activity on the right side. The right side is trying to do what the left side was doing. But now here's that same child and another child like him, and this is, I'm going to break it down for you. Here's their left sides. Sorry, here's their right sides before intervention. And 2 different kids up on the top of the screen. Below it is the same kid after intervention that followed those tenets of plasticity and was evidence-based. And what we see is, after the treatment program, the left side brain activity is greatly increased. So that little boy that you saw reading, who was at the 5th percentile, now is at the 45th percentile, guess what's happened to his brain? There's a whole new range of activity in the left side. There's a whole new range of wiring and connections, because that's what learning is. So when you successfully rebuild these skills, and we do it in a developmental fashion, which means we're actually doing a training program that actually builds the skills the same way we think skills build when you don't struggle to read. So we've built this whole developmental training program to try to help rebuild those phonological processing skills. And then we see less activity on the right side, because the right side now doesn't have to help out as much. The left side is actually doing the work and is making more progress. But because I'm a brain scientist who also does work in stroke, let me show you, that's not always a big concern for us, meaning which side is doing the work, because here's somebody who had an injury called a stroke. And here's their brain. And notice, here's their brain on the left side and on the right side, and the panel on the left is the brain before any intervention. The black holes that have an L next to them, that's where the stroke caused the brain to be damaged. That tissue dies. It doesn't come back. There's no way to regrow brain tissue. So this man is missing part of his brain. He was in his 40s. He had an unfortunate medical event that caused the blood flow to stop to the left side, and he lost part of the brain tissue, and afterwards he couldn't read as well. But the right slide shows now that left side, the right side has less activity. We start to see new activity over on the left side where the brain tissue still exists. So we've done 2 things. We've begun to rewire part of the left side and rebuild some of those connections. But we'll also, in some people, the damage will be so large, our only option is to retrain the right side. We're the only group in the US, UK, and Canada who has a published study of a woman who came to us after a stroke, and her stroke happened a long time ago. Give me a number of years, it's a long time. How long is a long time? 5, 10, 20, 30, keep going. 50, try 54 years ago she had a stroke. So she came to us at age 74, and she said, I still can't read my cookbooks. I had a stroke when I was 20, and now I'm 74 years old, and I can't read my cookbooks since my stroke, and I loved to cook. You know, I got married young, I loved being in the house, I loved to cook, and I can't read the cookbooks. Can you help me? And we had to tell her, look, you'll be participant number 3 in this brand new $1 million project that I was running. So we promise you nothing. We honestly don't know. We have a lot of theory that says it should work, but we can't guarantee it. We've not finished testing it. So we did about 150 hours of instruction with her, one-on-one, and the same thing, 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. And we made a massive change in her ability to read her cookbooks quietly to herself. We could not change her ability to read it out loud. There was too much damage in these motor control parts of the brain that actually controlled her out over at speaking. In her view, she was thrilled that we had changed her reading skills some 54 years later, because she didn't want to read the cookbook to her husband. She just wanted to read it to herself. So functionally, she was thrilled. So many times we learn more about how the brain works, how it wires, and you learn more about what we didn't know than actually what we did know. No one had proven that 54 years post-stroke, you still can make functional change in those skills. So for any of you who have kids you're working with, kids who are struggling, there's only one thing holding them back, and it's what you're doing. It's what program they have access to. It's what materials we're giving to them. And so it's trying to empower you with more knowledge to actually be able to do more, to help them more. There's key things that have to happen. Yes?
With your variety of programs, have you seen a difference between dyslexia learning effectiveness online versus in person?
No. We track the data very carefully because I'm a data scientist. So I can tell you every word every kid read in every session for the last 30 years. That's how long we've been doing this work. And 10 years of it's been online, and 30 of it years has been in the medical clinics. And we don't get any big changes in the actual duration because all our online instruction is Socratic. It's questioning, it's engaging, it's problem solving. So you get as much attention and focus online as you do in person. Albeit in person, there's more emotional connection. There's more, you can bump them and say, hey, great job, and high five, and you can't do any of that stuff online. So do I think you could have a little bit more broader impact in person? Yeah, I think so. Because I think any of you who work with kids, you know that you connect with them, you relate to them, and you get this emotional bond and this engagement bond that's really harder to do online. But in some situations, when I'm helping kids in India who are online, or we have kids in Singapore who are online, or I have kids in UAE and Saudi Arabia and Jordan who are online, they have no access to our services otherwise. So online is our albeit best option for them at this point in time.
Is there a difference with how the brain is formed for a child who has dyscalculia versus dyslexia?
We don't have any neuroanatomical studies showing where the difference is in dyscalculia. Like I showed you the fMRI studies of dyslexia. Nobody's done that yet that I know of with dyscalculia. But think of it this way. In this set of programs, there's a hierarchy to what we do, and there's a specific hierarchy. You can't come to my company and say, hey, I just want your math program. Because there's a developmental hierarchy in how this is done. Every language in the world, how do you learn it first? Speaking, reading, or spelling it? What do you do first with a language? Yeah, you speak it. So the speech processors are first language skill, and then it goes to reading skills. Then it goes to speaking skills and listening skills. Next comes comprehension. So our second program it works on what we call the semantic system. That's your comprehension system. Because now that you can hear words, you've got to be able to connect them to meaning and be able to explain things back to other people as well. So you build the speech processor first, the comprehension processor second, and then comes written expression. Writing sentences, writing paragraphs. That has a whole sequence of activities. It has a whole systematic hierarchy. There's a sequential order to what you do. Those are precursor skills to math. So basically math is actually just a foreign language. So we typically would say, would I teach Spanish before I finish this kid's English skills? And the answer is no. If I want to really make sure that their skills are strong, I'd finish building the skills in one language before I teach a second. But it doesn't mean you can't learn both at the same time. It just means it may take more time because they're not as well established.
So if a child has a parent that has dyscalculia and they have dyslexia, it's probably the same part of the brain, just at different levels?
We know that you to be able to remember the number 2 and remember what a 3 means and what does 16 mean, and sometimes you say 61 instead of 16, that's part word retrieval, which is part of that phonological speech processor. It's not a math skill, it's the language skill. So yes, commonly there is a lot of co-occurrence between the language skills and the dyslexia, but also the language skills and the dyscalculia. So in the medical clinic, we can test it all first and know exactly what's going on. But online, testing is not required because some families, if they pay for the evals, they don't have money for treatment. And so what's the point of doing the evals if you're not going to get any help to change the skills? You've wasted the money. We know they're struggling. We don't really have to have the diagnosis to know what to do about this part of it.
I have a child that has all three.
Yeah,
Would you suggest?
so do I.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do you suggest focusing on one area at a time, or would it be beneficial to go all in and address?
It's developmental hierarchy. It's dyslexia first. You change the phonological processor, you change the reading and spelling skills, then you go to the comprehension skills, then you go to the writing skills, and last would do the math skills. Because if you struggle to store the numbers and retrieve the numbers and struggle to think of concepts, then we're not at math concepts yet. We're at language. We're at auditory memory. We're at auditory perception. And that auditory system is interfering with the math skills. Because developmentally, this is what typically happens. Most of these phonological skills build between the ages of 0 and 4. And when they've built those phonological skills, then we start to get into the reading skills. And then we get into letters, with the reading skills. And then but we don't really do math concepts a little bit later on. It's more focused on spoken language and written language to read and spell first, and then goes to the math skills later on.
So if you have a 4-year-old, 4 to 5-year-old that is in school and is having remediation because of the inability to both remember words and
Yep.
letters, but
Yep.
also has a speech impediment.
Right.
So there's that hard to understand the verbal.
Yep, the articulation is difficult. Yes.
What would be the recommended course for somebody?
The good thing is that reading and spelling program for the Now Company handles all of the speech articulation focus as well as the phonological simultaneously. Yeah, and here's why. When you're teaching your child how to speak, and there's this myth where people are saying, well, reading has to be taught, not like speaking. And anybody who thinks a kid is born speaking really doesn't understand how the brain works. No child is born speaking. Okay? It's just so innate in how you're teaching them because you talk to them all the time. And you've given them thousands of hours of, quote, speaking instruction. So speaking takes just as much, if not more, instruction as reading and spelling do. So some of these folks are putting things on websites saying, well, the brain is not perfectly wired for reading, it has to be taught. Well, the brain ain't wired for speech either until you actually begin to give it the practice. And when you're trying to teach your child how to speak and you say ball and Johnny says ba, you're like, no honey, this is called a ball, and he says ba. Well, how are you going to help him say it properly? You're going to shout it louder in his ear? I said ball! And is that going to help him say it properly? No, it's not a hearing problem, it's not acoustic. You're going to innately look at him and go, honey, it's ball. And you're going to slow it down, you're going to stick your tongue up behind your teeth and go, ball, because you're going to show him the part you're doing that he ain't doing. And so you're actually innately showing him language as part visual, watch my mouth, it's part acoustic, hear what I'm saying, but it's part tactile, kinesthetic of the mouth, meaning can you feel where your tongue is and does it match where my tongue is?
Now, if you're doing that, and if educators, whether you're homeschooling or otherwise, are doing that as well, but there's still a disconnect, so you're trying to say ball, and instead of saying ba, they say something completely different.
Yeah. That's just a sign of how impaired that phonological processor is. And that's why when you teach a language, well, let me ask it this way. Guess what age kids start watching your lips as a parent? How old are they when they actually start noticing that when your lips move, sound comes out?
One day.
Yeah, that would be cool, but we can't prove it yet. But what they've proven scientifically, they use this really cool study with laser eye trackers. They put the baby with mom, and mom's looking at Sally, and she's going, hi, Sally, la, la, la. And they're like, where does Sally look? And the laser can tell you where their pupil is focusing. Up to 8 months of age, Sally only looks at your eyes. It's like facial recognition. At 8 months of age, boom, Sally's watching your lips move. And guess what most kids start doing by 8 months of age? Babbling. Now, they're trying to do what they see your mouth do. And by doing the babbling, they're beginning to build the connection between the movement, plus the acoustics, plus the visual. They're beginning to wire that phonological processor, and they typically build it from the age 0 to 4 before we teach them any alphabet letters. And the other key concept that I didn't mention is developmental pieces are concrete first, abstract later on. So let me ask you this. Why does the letter B? You guys are all adults. You all have literacy skills. Why? What's the logic behind the shape of our alphabet letters? Why does the B say B? How come the B doesn't say G? How come the B doesn't say A? Or how come the letter B is not the shape for the sound U? What's the logic behind the shape of our alphabet letters? Did you learn that in school? Well, that's good, because there isn't any. Trick question. There's no logic whatsoever. These are abstract, made-up shapes. And we learn from the child development specialist, Piaget, that children learn concrete things first, abstract things second. So the most important thing you can be doing with your kids right now is make them watch your mouth. When your child is mixing up your B's and D's, guess what they're not watching? They're not watching your mouth. Because when you say, "Buh," how does your mouth move? Is it your tongue or your lips? Everyone try it. Just say, "Buh." What's moving, your tongue or your lips? Yeah, it's your lips. And they come together and they pop apart. When you say, "Duh," what's moving now? Duh, duh. It's not the lips, it's the tongue. And so when you begin to understand the mouth parts, lips versus tongue, that's the concrete features of speech sounds. And if they begin to notice what's happening with you, then you begin to help better wire the brain's ability to differentiate the "buh" sound from the "duh" sound. And then later you get to the actual letter shapes.